there is inevitably a challenge for the U.S., which, as Shadi said, has been a status quo power for more than a generation in the region, in coping with dramatic change. And I think there's no foreign policy challenge that's more difficult for a superpower than dealing with fundamental political change in one of its allies. And that's what happened in Egypt. We've seen this over and over again, whether it was Chile under Pinochet or the Philippines under Marcos. This is just a really tough foreign policy challenge for the United States. Given that, I think that, Obama's signal insight here was one that I think a lot of us, Raj and I and others were doing scholarship on in advance of the Arab Spring, which is that the events we saw erupt were the culmination of trends that had been building in the region for years, for a decade or more. Economic trends, demographic trends, changes in the information environment that fundamentally altered the relationship between government and citizens. And so when those protests erupted, there was a sense of inevitability about it. And recognizing that and saying, this is not a train that the United States can stop. This is change we're going to have to deal with. That was a crucial moment and a crucial decision, and I think very much the right one. The biggest challenge I think going forward, continuing to walk this tightrope, I would highlight two things. Number one is a budgetary question or a monetary question. Not that U.S. policy is judged entirely by our foreign assistance, not that we can use our foreign assistance to achieve all our policy goals on the ground, but Shadi pointed out the disparity of the response. Given the intensity of American interests invested in this region, the intensity of international security interests invested in this region, the fact that we haven't been able to mobilize a larger degree of financial support, not only from the U.S., but multilaterally, is troubling. Now, of course, we've been in a global economic recession. We're constrained. We're less constrained than some of our international partners. But that is all exacerbated by our political environment, by the fact that we haven't been able to have a normal appropriations process between the legislative and executive branch in years. So, I was serving in the administration during the Arab Awakening. We were trying to mobilize assistance for a response. We didn't know when or if we were going to have a budget. It's very hard to mobilize resources when you don't know what the top line figure is going to be. So that's one thing, the relationship between our domestic politics and our foreign policy. The other thing, though, gets back to the point you started with, which is these protests that we've seen over the last couple of weeks and the anxiety that I think has been provoked by them among many Americans over what does this portend regarding the future of the region, the rise of Islamist movements to power. Does this mean that this is just bad for the U.S.? Look at this backlash. I think, putting this in a broader context, again, for those of us who have been watching this region for a while, the initial victory of Islamist political movements in the wake of authoritarianism was a surprise to no one. It was, to some extent, inexorable. But the continued victory or prominence of these movements, I think, is very questionable. And in fact, what we saw in these protests over the last couple of weeks, in many ways, was an argument going on among and between different Islamist movements using us and using this video as a kind of political football. That competition for what's the nature of Arab politics going to be, how Muslim is it going to be, how Sunni is it going to be, how Orthodox is it going to be, those arguments are going to go on for a long time. So I think the challenge the U.S. faces going forward, no matter who's elected in November, is trying to build relationships with these countries while they're having that argument, knowing that we are going to continue to be caught in the middle.